Hi, everybody. I'm Dr. Boz, and we are back again for an update from Kylie and her growing, beautiful baby. The last time we were here, we put in a glucose monitor that was continuous, and we're back for a checkup on how she's doing. Just want to say thank you to all that have left comments for Kylie and encouraged her. It is incredibly important that when somebody says, yes, I will go out in the public and share what my experience has been with trying to change your diet and monitoring your glucose, that it's been a powerful testimony to this audience on how supportive you've been of Kylie and how much that feedback means to her, but also to me on this channel. So thank you. We're going to dive in and just do an update from Kylie. So let's start with, how many weeks are you?
25.
25 weeks. So, and all is good. You have no contractions, no troubles. And
No.
yeah, you said the other day that you fell down the stairs, and
Yeah.
sounds dramatic, but it was a few.
Apparently happens to every single person that you talk to.
Well, those joints definitely are looser when they're pregnant. And
Yeah.
I used that excuse for many years after being pregnant. So,
Yeah.
But other than that, you had, the last time we were here, we put in this glucose monitor. And why don't you share with everybody how long it took to really calibrate that and what you learned from that?
So I think the first, upon insertion, right, you had to have like a 12-hour window. The info, the pamphlet said 1, so I was just assuming that it was just going to be 1 hour and then I could screen it, but it kept giving me a 12-hour notice and, 8 hours, 7 hours, 6 hours. So it did take a full 12 hours to calibrate or get that sensor reading. But after that, you basically just press a button and hold it up to your arm and scan it, and you get your sugar on the spot.
Okay. So tell me, could you feel it in your arm?
I could not. And actually, when I removed it this morning, I touched the needle to see what that's like. And it's actually not a needle.
Oh.
It's more like a plastic.
Like a filament, a microfilament that's got a sensor in it?
Which I could only start really feeling it maybe toward the very last day. So last night when I was going to, pull it off because my sensor had ran out for that 14-day window. I think as it kind of starts to pull away from your body or it kind of disintegrates on you, then you can maybe feel that little filament a little bit more. But it wasn't uncomfortable at any point. It didn't hurt.
Yeah.
It didn't even hurt. I couldn't even feel it when you put it in me.
The biggest pushback that I've seen is, first of all, the access, that you still need a prescription to get one of these, which I think is a little ridiculous because it's such a powerful tool. But then also that it's in your arm and it sounds like this invasive, but every patient that I've done this with, it's powerful how much they say, I couldn't hardly feel it.
No.
And then they get this other section of what I think is the discovery of your chemistry. So share, because we told you, don't be perfect. We want you to really live your life and even test foods that maybe you wouldn't have eaten in the past, but you want to know what it does to your system. So why don't you share what you learned with that?
So I would say that, the very first week of trying that was when I really more indulged to see how my sugar was affected. I mean, with gestational diabetes, you really have to be concerned about that 140 limit, right? So you do your sugar test, you see how your body processes that sugar, and then that's it. You either have gestational diabetes or you don't. So when my sugar was tested, it was 143 when it's supposed to be 140. So they're like, yep, you have gestational diabetes. Do you want to move forward with a 3-hour test? And I said, no, right, I'll just test them at home. So I think what I wanted to do was I wanted to try eating a cupcake. I wanted to try eating cereal or things that I really don't eat to see how much it really is affecting me, and more so how this is going to affect the baby.
Right.
So that was first week, and then into second week, that was my experimentation with my keto foods.
Oh, yeah?
I have a cereal.
So let's go back. So cereal is this thing that in pregnancy, if you've for those of you that haven't been pregnant, it's like life. I can remember not being a cereal person, and then I got pregnant, and I ate cereal the first months, and I never had.
You can stomach.
It was so weird. So I'm I'm not really a cereal person, but definitely had my own limitations of how many more times I could possibly eat cereal in a lifetime, and they all ended up in those months of being pregnant.
Yeah.
So what cereals did you remember? What did you do? Sugary ones? Did you do?
So I actually haven't had like real sugar cereals since my first trimester when I was sick and couldn't eat anything
right.
And now I don't really crave it, but I do have like a keto cereal that I eat. It's called Stay Steady.
Okay.
Right. I buy it online from a website. You can't like get it in the stores. But I think it's like, I don't know, 12 carb grams for a whole cup. So I'll generally do like a half a cup or whatever. And then I stay within like that 7, I try and stay within 5 or 7 carbs per meal max.
Sure.
And that's always my goal. And then I'll do just a splash of heavy cream for the milk, right? Just to give it some moisture, of that feel. Yeah. So I ate that, and my blood sugars pretty much did not move.
Really?
Which was interesting. So I would test right away. My fasting sugars had been pretty steadily 77, which you want them under 90 per the medical community.
Right.
And then I would eat that cereal with the heavy whipping cream, and it would maybe go up to 78, 79.
That's really good.
It really is good. Like, that was 100%. I did not expect that. And then other keto foods, like, that you think, like, I make this type of meatloaf with, like, an erythritol-based, like, ketchup and brown sugar type thing.
Okay.
And that was maybe a 20, spike in my blood sugar, so I was more around the 100s.
Okay. So what kind of sugar does that cereal that didn't cause the spike, do you remember what it used? So let's look at the label and say it's got grits and gluten and protein and soy isolate and some rice flour.
Cane sugar.
Cane sugar.
That is interesting. I would not have expected that.
So where do you see cane sugar at?
Right there after the corn.
Oh, right. I totally didn't. I skipped right over it. So it has almonds. I mean, it looks healthy when you look at it. And then you say, okay, so carbohydrates, 21.
21. I thought that was 12.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, having
Did
said
I grab
that,
the right one?
Yeah.
I
So,
totally thought it was 12. Okay.
but look at the outside of that saying, oh, there's only 2 sugar in there.
Right.
So.
And I'm a sucker for these like fake keto foods.
Oh, I know.
But I'm happy that it didn't affect my blood sugar that much.
So it is a testimony to say this is why we love you testing, is that there's a bunch of fiber in there. And then there's not just, wheat-based products. You've got some other places where they, I think one was it rye? Corn, rice, some whole wheat, but and then some almonds. The point is that it's a mixture. It's not just the one food source, which we've all learned. This is a really difficult thing on the human body to only have that one food source. We all overeat wheat. Welcome to the Midwest. Yeah, wheat and corn. When you looked at that lack of rise in blood sugar, did you check a ketone during that time? No, I didn't do that. That's okay. So what happens when we know the glucose and we don't know the ketone is, for sure, we know that she can control her sugar.
Right.
Okay. So this is the difference between somebody who, I know you failed the glucose test, but do you have the worst case of gestational diabetes? No. In fact, you might have passed the other more advanced test, and then you would have been really not. But I think that's just parsing the wrong kinds of details. You want to say, oh, if your insulin is growing insensitive, if your sugars are too high, that growth on the baby and the baby's brain, it's really important. So setting all that aside, when we know what your glucose is, but we don't know what your ketone is, and we can see that sugar level from the cereal was nice and steady, what we can be really confident in is that either your insulin does a great job of still suppressing your sugar, which I think is probably your case, that you are still young, most in your generation still have a really heavy response from their insulin. It's still sensitive. So when they've had the weight on for 20, 30 years, that's when that insulin becomes insensitive. Doesn't take that long, but I can be much more confident that when I see their sugar stay stable, either they didn't absorb any carbs, or if they absorbed carbs and their sugar stays stable, it just says that their insulin is really working to stabilize and keep that sugar level. So now go to the time where it shot up 20 points. That was where the erythritol and
Yeah, it was like the reduced sugar Heinz ketchup, right? That's like a staple in our house. And it's like a sucrin gold, erythritol based.
And that really shot your...
Yeah, which is surprising because erythritol, like when I put it in my coffee creamer, does not have that same effect.
Oh, really? So you wonder what else was in there?
Yeah.
Like maybe the tomatoes from the...
Could be.
I don't know.
Yeah.
So did you check ketones when you did that one? No, not very many ketones.
No, I'm not checking many
ketones. Well, and that's okay. What I wanted to double check was if you have the glucose if you're checking the glucose, did you ever double check it with your own monitor?
I didn't, only because I felt like, and when I had checked this out at the pharmacy, he's like, if you ever feel like maybe it's too low or not high enough, then that's maybe when you should double check. And I felt like anytime that I would eat more sugar or carbs within a meal, I could feel it, right? I'm like drowsy, you kind of feel inflamed, just kind of like those things. But I never felt like it was inaccurate. Now, from what I've read on the internet, there are some people where you do have a faulty sensor. So that's something to keep an eye on if this is like a lifestyle that anyone chooses, that there are times where you will have a faulty sensor where it's giving you inaccurate readings.
Sure.
So you would want to double check at that point. And as far as I know, you can just contact the people and they'll send you a free one.
Well, I've had folks put in that monitor and I tell them, don't try to compare it to your glucose monitor for at least the first 24 hours once it's calibrated. Because even though the calibration has set, I've just had patients say it didn't make sense to me until about a day later. So I tell them not to look until it gets to that because it gets them very anxious. Like, which sugar do I believe? I'm like, just hang tight. Yeah. And they're not like fragile diabetics. It's the similar story we're doing, which is learn about you, see what it's doing. So there's a couple other things that when I look at so let's try this. When you ate the cupcake, how high did the sugar go?
Well, there were a couple instances of cupcakes within the last 2 weeks. But at one point it shot up all the way to, and this could be a combination of like the other foods that were eaten.
Sure.
But I was at like 155 at one point, which was like, okay.
Oh yeah.
Now we're too high, right? Like that is way too high. That's the number that people do not want to see.
Right.
That's what results in your large babies.
Yes.
So that was kind of an eye opener. But other than that, it was like the highest I've really ever gone is like 120, 125, even with
eating a
dessert or like something if we have family in town, like
it's such a big deal. And don't you think, did you feel that feedback loop in your brain saying, oh, and now I can see why I don't do that?
And you feel like a disaster. It just doesn't feel good.
Right. That other side of things when I can remember when I was fasting and I was irritable and I went to the kitchen and I found gummy bears. And I then said, okay, I'm just going to check my sugars. And it was like up to almost 200. And you're like, okay, I totally need to pay attention. But of course, it's that moment where you do something that you know you shouldn't, and then you are brave enough to check your sugars.
Yeah. And it's like you'd rather just avoid it, right?
Right, absolutely.
Yeah.
Oh, so if you had to think of what you would you recommend like other pregnant people do this? I mean, do you think it really helped change the behavior enough that you'll stay away from the sugary foods throughout the rest of pregnancy, or how do you think it impacted you?
I mean, the thing is that being on this lifestyle for a year, like I know I physically do better. Right. I think every pregnant person, including myself, sometimes you justify like, oh, I'm pregnant, I can eat that. And it's almost harder being pregnant trying to do keto than like when I wanted to lose weight last year and doing keto, because it's like every day you would have that motivation of like getting on the scale and being like, oh, I'm down, 0.2 pounds or whatever. Here, you step on the scale after doing keto for a week and you're like, oh, I've gained a pound. Great. You just don't have like that instantaneous, which is why I think keto has been like a fad diet. And like so many people have really tried to jump on the keto bandwagon because you do lose weight fast. But the thing is, it's like you have to maintain this as a lifestyle. And I think about, the kids that we have these days are obese. They have diabetes. They have all these things. And why? Like, we have to ask ourselves, why are our children, we work so hard when we're pregnant to give them the best care. We do all these tests. We eat the right foods. And then all of a sudden they pop out and we're handing them cookies. Like,
Absolutely.
why are we doing that? So we as a nation need to really look at that and be like, what are we setting? We are the fattest nation in the world, right? And we really have to look at ourselves and being like, how are we growing our children today?
See, this is the difference between an internist and a OB-GYN. The OB-GYN doctors would always say, our women are so motivated to change the world and make the best decisions. And I'm like, I swear to God, as soon as the baby's born, all of this stuff goes away. But I'm like, oh, it's inspiring. See how much she wants to change the world? We should do that. We should keep that. All right, so we're going to do a couple things. I have a slide here. So at this conference that I was at recently, they talked about the ketogenic diet and what it does for the baby's brain. So they said we're going to take some lessons from a study done in 2014 on what we learned from an infant's brain and the growth of their brains. So I'm going to read a couple things off this point slide. So they learned that ketones in the brain, especially in the infant's growth, that ketones were essential, meaning the baby could not survive without them. Essential, and supplied 25 to 35% of the brain's energy. So I don't know if you remember this when you were doing a much more hardcore keto when you were losing weight, but there's the big controversy or the big struggle saying your brain needs glucose, it has to have sugar to run. And I was so encouraged when I saw this presentation, and that this study is out in 2014 saying your brain has the ability to, not only the ability to use ketones, but what this lecture went on to say is the more your brain practices using ketones, the sugar that floats around in our body goes from circulating and then it has to go through the blood-brain barrier into your brain. That the more ketones that go across the blood-brain barrier, the less glucose goes into the brain, meaning the brain prefers the ketones after it's been practiced or adapted at using them. And I've always had just a tough time connecting, well, how does that work and how do I drive that message home? And when this lecturer went through that a baby is born with 25% dependency on ketones, and that the transporter for their ketones continues to work at a more aggressive rate as they're growing, with a prediction that their brain growth was better, was essential, was dependent on these ketones. It just really was empowering to me to say, okay, this is one of the other places where you continue to learn about the ketogenic diet and you get lots of people saying you need glucose for the brain. Like, yeah, your brain does need glucose. But it isn't that once you're keto adapted, there is actually a preference for the ketones in our brain. Okay, so the other big naysayers out there for the ketogenic diet talk about how when you make the fat in your brain, you can tag to see where the carbons or where do the supplies for that fat come from. And when you're looking at the development of that baby's brain, we learned that 90% of the carbons used to make brain lipids, which is like your cholesterol, and then the lining around the myelin, which is like, think of it as the insulation around the wires in the baby's brain. When you could see or tag where those carbons came from, 90% of those carbons building the baby's brain came from ketones. And again, a very powerful connection to when we see what happens when a mom's blood glucose is high, and how do we correlate that to these other findings we've connected, which is the decreased, the increased mood disorders, increased struggles with mental health, linked to the gestational diabetes. And I do a lot of work in the community with how do you help kids through these struggles. And I keep going back to, we need to start way earlier, way earlier. Right. The next thing that the lecturer went through was that the ketones that the baby is making are produced from the medium chain triglycerides that are in breast milk. So you get all these, if you go to the supplement world and you type in keto supplements, you're going to find a list of medium chain triglycerides. And when I was researching how do you make a medium chain triglyceride, where do they come from? Most of them in the supplement world come from coconuts. But I thought it was very interesting that one place that you can find a very abundant amount of medium chain triglycerides was rat breast milk. I totally say that every time. I'm thinking, who studied that? Yes. I'm like, why not just look at man's breast milk? And there is an abundant amount in our breast milk. It's one of the other reasons why when you look at babies as they're born and notice when you give them a bath that they don't shiver. Have you ever seen this? Ever heard about this?
No.
So babies, when they're born, if you would look at their fat under a microscope, or if you would look at it, it's under their skin, you can't see it. It's brown. It's called a brown fat, as opposed to our fat, which is mostly white. Yeah. When you become keto adapted, we take our white fat and we brown it, we tan it. And so you say, what? That sounds really weird. Yeah. What's happening there? And what's happening is the mitochondria and the metabolism within fat of brown fat versus white fat is much different. And a baby is born with an abundance. They have the most brown fat you'll ever have. And what their fat does is it generates heat. So that's why when you'll see them, when you give the baby a bath, they don't shiver. I mean, they'll cry and they'll fuss, but the shivering comes when that white fat has now taken over and their brown fat is missing. You go into really tiny babies who don't have much brown fat and they shiver. Isn't that interesting?
That is super interesting.
So yeah, as we look at what kind of fat do we want in our bodies, brown fat burns energy. So you want to have brown fat. It keeps us warm. It's those people who have that strong metabolism. They never get cold. They have higher brown fat. Keto adaptation promotes the browning of your fat like a baby. So I always thought that was very interesting. The last statement of this was that the MCT from those medium chain triglycerides from the breast milk, actually some of it goes to produce that brain development, but another big percentage of that medium chain triglyceride is recycled into their brown fat, ready to be activated and to be usable when they need it. And again, that's how babies survive, is that their fat is just a whole different organ when compared to our fat. So continue to keep your ketones high for your baby and her development.
So would this look differently with like an obese woman who does not monitor?
Right. You mean her baby or the fat?
Both. Like, would baby come out with more white fat than brown fat? Would it have any brown fat?
Right. So when you have a high ketone state as the mom, you're you could say stressing and challenging the baby to have that ketogenic higher level for them, meaning they don't have the excessive sugar. You have high sugar, baby has high sugar. That's what gestational diabetes is all the warning about. When you lower your blood sugar and force the baby to grow in a ketogenic state, this is also what we think let's take the reverse. When you have gestational diabetes, we know there is an increased risk of obesity and insulin resistance. And we think it's correlated to the development of that baby outside of the excessive amounts of ketones in that setting. So can I say is there a double-blinded controlled study that you've got this? No, but if it was my baby and I was doing it, I would absolutely be keto throughout the pregnancy, especially knowing what we know about the brain development. I mean, that's my whole clinic, is how do you repair brains? And my goodness, if you come to any of my brain lectures, you're going to hear all of the torture things I did to my kids saying, it's good for your brain. This is good for your brain. So I would have been keto for their brain.
Okay, so one question that I feel like is amongst the social media world is that a lot of people are saying, don't ever get yourself out of keto. It's very dangerous. Your brain is producing ketones and then now it's relying on glucose and then it's going back to ketones. So don't ever do it. Super dangerous. And that is the word that is used. Can you kind of speak on that a little bit?
So let me make sure I clarify this. So they're saying that if you're in keto, if you're living the ketogenic lifestyle and you're making a baby, you should stay only keto and never go out of ketosis?
Yes, to the point where like when they're doing the gestational diabetes test, they're like, don't even do it. That 75 grams of carbs is going to kick you out of ketosis. Super dangerous for the baby. And like I said, using that word. And it's one of those things that I think we probably need a little bit more knowledge on it.
Well, so here's the carb cycling is really something that's talked about in the pregnancy world and not the pregnancy world. When you look at what happens when you're keto adapted and then you add glucose to the point where it's a cupcake or something, or your glucose tolerance test. I mean, the beauty of being metabolically fit or metabolically flexible is that your body will use ketones, and if the presence of glucose comes about, you will use those glucose molecules and then go back into ketosis. Okay, so the fat molecules have much more energy in them. There's a much more abundant supply. And although when you first go keto, that flip over to the other side is a nightmare and really hard on the brain and the mood and irritability and cravings, all those things. But once you're keto adapted, you can go back and forth. There is a study out that, again, I got this from the Metabolic Health Summit when they gave a lecture on what have they seen with carb cycling. These people weren't pregnant, but I think it was super telling to me to say, because usually I'm defending the other side of this, which is saying, I think I lose more weight when I carb cycle. I feel better when I carb cycle. I think carb cycling is better.
Sure.
This information was from the Applied Science and Performance Institute, and they talked about how they studied some of their athletes who were they were either just becoming keto adapted or just starting a ketogenic diet, and they took half of them and they did carb cycling, and they did the other half who were strict keto. So I think it's important to point out what is carb cycling in this situation. So they had Monday through Friday where everybody was keto, with most of their energy came from fat, with only a small percentage, I think it was 10% carbs and protein, maybe 15% carbs and protein, but it was a real strong ketogenic diet. And all of the athletes on Monday through Friday did that. On the weekends, the carb cyclers were allowed half of their calories to come from carbs. So that's still pretty good. I mean, you look at most of America and they like 70% carbs, that is not uncommon. So I still think they were pretty healthy at only allowing them half of those carbs. So what they looked at the ketones, the blood ketones that they found Monday through Friday. So again, they didn't test on the weekends, but they had the athletes tested Monday through Friday. And if you were in this carb cycling group, you started out the week with zero, pretty much zero on Monday, ability to produce ketones. But it took you almost till Friday. Sometimes they hit it on Thursday, but between Thursday and Friday before they would see the first ketone, meaning you got that ketone, that blood ketone to a 0.5, they would not do that till Thursday or Friday. And then of course the next day they would get back to carb cycling. So as opposed to those who were keto adapt or stayed in the ketogenic state, they found their ketones ranged from that 0.9 to 1.2, and they did that steadily over the course of the 6 weeks that this went on. But I thought it was really powerful to see what is their ketone level. But it wasn't until they showed the next slide that really got my attention, though, because I'm like, oh, that's interesting. That makes sense that if you're carb cycling, your ketones are going to be low and you're not really in ketosis. Okay. But they said, hey, guess what? The athletes lost. They weren't all athletes. They were on the ketogenic diet to lose weight, but their participants lost the same amount of weight. You're like, see, carb cycling works. You've got the ability to lose weight. But what was so interesting was the people on the ketogenic diet lost 3 times the amount of fat. So as they looked at DEXA scans, looking what percentage of their body fat was lost, the ketogenic people 3 times as much fat compared to the carb cyclers. So it leaves the question, what body mass were they losing if they didn't lose fat, but they lost body weight? So where do you think it came from?
Water.
It's actually protein.
Protein.
Yes.
They don't want to lose that.
Right. You're these athletes trying to become more keto, keto, lose weight, and they're obviously working with the Applied Institute. These people are really, they study athletes and how to get the best performance. So it's almost like a cardinal sin in their world to lose muscle mass. So when they were the carb cyclers, they sacrificed that muscle mass. Now, they were really careful to point out that these were the people who were recently adapted or recently on the ketogenic diet. They weren't the athletes who had been keto for 3 years and then they carb cycled. That's not who we're talking about. We're talking about the newbies, the people that have only been 3 to 6 months into a ketogenic diet. And if you're saying, but I need that carb cycling to feel better, what I worry is that they are sacrificing protein loss or that muscle loss, which we do not want. Anyway, I thought that was very interesting.
Yeah.
So do I think if I was pregnant that I would use the word danger with carb cycling? I would not. I would say that the longer you've been in ketosis before you get pregnant, or even if you're doing a ketogenic diet when you're pregnant, that it's going to help your baby. It's going to help the baby's growth. It's going to keep your own blood sugars lower. But I don't think it's dangerous if you have carbs when you're pregnant. I do think that if you're going to lose weight, I would stay on a ketogenic diet really solid before you ever think of doing things like carb cycling.
You know, and one thing just to give my 2 cents on this too is that I feel like since I have been pregnant, it normally would take me 3 days. If I kicked myself out of ketosis and had a weekend where we went on vacation or went out of town and we're like, yeah, we want to try all these new places, it would take a solid 3 days. So every time that I would consider going out of ketosis, I'd be like, oh my gosh, is this worth 3 days? And having some of those keto flu symptoms come back, not to the extent of when I first started, because that was terrible. But like have it come back, that was always like the way in my mind. Being pregnant, it maybe takes 28 hours.
Seriously?
To get yourself back into ketosis from a day. And I'm not saying that I have been full keto my whole pregnancy, because we know the first 14 weeks was horrible and I couldn't. But from this 14 to 24, I've kind of, done more of the carb cycling with the knowledge that it's going to take me about 27, 28 hours before I can get a 1.7 to come up on that keto monitor.
Well, so I think that's also, you look at you talk about athletes talking about catabolism or anabolism. Catabolism is when they're trying to cut weight or when your body's losing weight. Anabolic is when you're building something within your body. And there's no better anabolic state than a pregnancy. You're building another human being. So when you look at this anabolic state, it does shift that rate at when you can make a ketone and how quickly the body will go into ketosis. So it really does kind of fit with that quicker adaptation into a ketogenic state for you is probably in part that your system, your mitochondria have remembered where this comes from, but also I bet that it has a lot to do with that anabolic state of building a baby. Yeah. So, all right. So final thing, do you think you're going to use the second sensor? You're going to try to monitor yourself again? Not right away, but maybe.
Yeah, I think I'm probably going to go pick it up here within the next couple of days.
Oh, okay.
I literally peeled it off my arm this morning, but I'd like to, just because, I don't know if I necessarily fall into that gestational diabetes realm. I might kind of have wobbled in and out of it, but with the fasting being at 77 and every meal around the 100 mark, I don't really know if I fall into the big you have gestational diabetes category, but it is good to know. And I think for my own biofeedback, I like to see that. And, it is a little bit of a cost, but I feel like in the grand scheme of things, it's worth it to figure out because not all of my keto foods that I eat regularly did I get in my
2 weeks, right?
2 weeks of having.
Yeah, I think the one thing I've learned about what I like about once you have the meter and you just are paying for the sensor, I tell patients use it as this kind of intensity signal that you're going to say, I'm going to study myself for 2 weeks. And then I find that it's very worth it. Yeah. I've had other people who've just kind of, whether boredom or for whatever reason, said, I don't want to check my sugars anymore. And I said, let's just do this continuous glucose monitor for 2 weeks, because that feedback of teaching them about themselves, man, is that a powerful change. Yeah. Well, I just want to say thank you again. Yeah. We're going to keep checking in on you and following her pregnancy, trying to answer questions that are out there in the ketogenic and pregnancy world. I do want to say thank you again. And for those of you watching, please take a minute to give her a comment. In the show notes, you'll see all the things let's try that again. In the show notes, you'll see the book that I wrote, Any Way You Can. Anybody who buys that during this section, it is a big... I'll try that again. In the show notes, you'll see all the links to some of the stuff we talked about, as well as the links, as well as... Billy, how many times are you going to do this? So in the show notes, you'll see several links. One of them is to the book that I wrote, Any Way You Can. Thanks for all of you that have bought that, and even more thanks to those that have left an Amazon book review. I really appreciate that. Again, give a big high five to Kylie, and special prayers that her baby and her health continue to be perfect and awesome.
Thank you.
You bet. Signing off, I'm Dr. Boz, helping your health one ketone at a time.
Please subscribe to my channel. And don't forget to click the notification bell so you don't miss out on any new videos. Stay tuned.